The problem I'd like to talk today is the simple view is the science is trustworthy because it deals only with facts, not with values. But obviously now many people argue that non-epistemic values play a very important role in scientific inquiry on many different levels. For example, in classificatory practices and generally about the metaphysics of science, in the way in which we divide the world, or the ontology we accept is sometimes value-based, especially in cases of biomedicine or in cases of ecology, for example. Second important aspect when values are important in scientific, non-epistemic values are important in scientific inquiry is affecting scientific methodologies. For example, the way we conduct statistical analysis may be value-loaded in some sense, and setting the level of evidence needed for drawing conclusions or recommendations is also value-based on our risk preferences. And I will refer now to 3 examples related to bioethics to visualize what I mean by these 3 cases of non-epistemic values. So first case is human embryos case, and generally not only human embryos but also entities with embryo-like features. For example, today in the European Union, processes concerning human embryos cannot be patented because it is claimed that patenting such processes would in some way violate the dignity of human embryos or humanity at all. But genetic stem cells are excluded from this prohibition by the European Biopatent Directive. Why? Because there is very small difference in definition. Parthenogenetic cells, in contrast with, let's say, standard embryos, do not have the capacity to develop into a born human embryo. At least today they don't have this type of capacity. So the problem is that this capacity in this case is context dependent. It can be measured after realization of these capacities in controlled environments. So there is no such thing as value neutral environment in which we can judge that embryos or some stem cells have genuine intrinsic potential. So any forward-looking definition of embryos or any other biological structure is grounded in specific normative evaluation, what counts as normal and what counts as not normal environment. So in this way, what I want to visualize in this point is not that there are many different moral views about moral status of embryo. It is obvious that there are different moral views on the moral status of embryo. What I try to show is that there are scientific, let's say, evaluation that may influence definitions of embryos. I mean, in one context we define something as an embryo, and we say that we cannot patent, for example, some processes on this being. In the other cases, we define environment in such a way that we allow patenting. So it has enormous consequences for research, what researchers can do and what researchers cannot do. The second, let's say, case study is inductive risk case and generally statistic analysis. The standard requirement for drug approval is that there must be at least 2 phase 3 randomized control trials in which experimental drug is deemed more efficacious than placebo or other control substances. So a positive trial, it means that one in which an experimental group appears to gain some benefit from the experimental intervention compared to the control group, and this apparent benefit is deemed statistically significant. Yes, so p-value of a frequentist statistical test is less than 0.5. And obviously this is also in some sense related to some value we accepted. In particular, it is this threshold and this whole process of accepting drugs in recent, either in the United States or the European Union, is based on some trade-off between two types of risk. On the one hand, we are risking that we are approving a drug as having a favorable effectiveness harm profile when it in fact does not have this favorable effectiveness harm profile, and on the other hand, we are risking rejecting a drug as not having a favorable effectiveness harm profile when in fact it does. So this 0.5 p-value is in some way representation of our trade-offs, of our risk preferences about this type of trade-off between approving and rejecting, I mean between false positive and false negatives. And third case study is about the global burden of disease. Global burden of disease is, probably you know, it's important index that was created in the 90s to show how can we improve health of different population in different places. I mean, to which part of, let's say, health economy we should concentrate our efforts to have the most gain in health in some population. So, for example, in Christopher Murray, who created this index in the 90s, claimed that the burdens of mental illness have been seriously underestimated. Psychiatric conditions are responsible almost 11% of disease burden worldwide. And the question is how they can know that it's 11%. How can we measure exactly that 11% of disease burden worldwide is psychiatric, not 5, not 20, etc., etc. And obviously there are some measures about health, but these measures are dependent, and this global burden of disease conclusions were driven in some extent or even largely by two value choices. They accepted discounting of value of future life, and second, age weighting. You see this graph, and they accepted this type of weighting of age. So the value of death at different points of life are valued differently. So, for example, death at the beginning of life is not so wrong, let's say. The value when you are a teenager is the worst, so you see this peak. And then it goes slowly down, and again, death at the end of your life, for example, in age 90 is again not so important from this point of view, from this global burden of disease point of view. So this results in giving more weight to health conditions that commonly affect adults or older children rather than elderly and young children, as you see. Second, this results in concentrating on disability rather than death as a primary impact, and have negative effects relatively close to the onset or diagnosis of the condition rather than far in the future. So as you see, different, if we accepted different, for example, shape of this curve, or if we discounted differently future gains and risks, so we could have different evaluations of global burden of disease. So for example, we could have not 11% but 5 if we do not discount, or we have different age weighting shape. There are arguments for desirability of value-free ideal, and this three most important or most frequently accepted arguments refer to veracity. So scientists should pursue discovery of knowledge, not some expression of some values. So universality is the second. Scientists should produce results usable for anyone, for purposes not anticipated by the researcher. And the third one, that is most related with problem of trust. So this is authority. Scientists should produce a trustworthy body of knowledge that has broadly recognized social legitimacy. So the problem is that it may be rational for the public to place less trust in the conclusions of science where major conclusions are sensitive to different value judgments, as you noticed in the last 3 examples. And this is really serious problem, because why we should trust science if science is just partially expression of some value judgments, some interests, or some more or less subjective preferences, as you noticed on the 3 previous examples. So I would like to make some simple distinction about trust in the context of this facts versus values distinction. This is a simple case, simple story that I adapted from recent paper. So let's imagine that you ask 3 people for advice how to invest your money, and their credential and risk profiles are very different. In the first case, person has no knowledge about such matters, so in this case, this person just does not merit basic trust, even basic trust. So second person has some proper credentials about investment, but this person has very different risk profile. For example, it is unlike me. Let's say he is not risk averse, and the third person has also very proper credential. Moreover, they are like me, so he is risk averse. So in this first person, obviously, this first case exemplifies the absence of trust. The second case exemplifies some basic trust. I mean, I trust him because he knows matter, let's say factual matters. And in this third case, the trust is deeper, let's say, or enhanced, because we share our values in relevant sense. We share our values how to invest money. I mean, we are both risk averse, let's say. So how should we solve this problem about values, non-epistemic values and trust? The first case is just, some people say that we should be more transparent in our values. I mean, scientists should be asked, it is a quotation from Elliot and Resnick book, should be as transparent as possible about the ways in which interests and values may influence their work. So they should just express everything. And there are cases, for example, in recent pandemic, in COVID-19, there's a quotation from Journal of Medical Ethics that exactly represents this type of reasoning. Were they, health authorities, accurate and transparent in their communications, perhaps people could have better understood when shifting evidence led to a new policy direction without forming the impression that those changes were whimsical or defective, and without eroding trust in institutions and public officials. So this quotation suggests that it is just transparency, and this transparency about shifting evidence should result in trust. If there is no transparency, there is some rumors that maybe something going on, something wrong with this policy or scientific research. The assumption of this view is that knowing that I have a conflict interest will typically reduce your trust in what I tell you. The main problem with this transparency account is that I think that's the main problem is that scientists themselves are not fully aware how values may influence their work. I mean, if you read medical journals, people are very rarely aware of values, non-epistemic values, for example, involved in evaluation of, let's say, drug regulation or something like this. So this is main problem with this approach, that how can we be transparent how scientists can be transparent if they are not fully self-aware about their values and values that are related with their research practices. The second problem, quite easy, is that there are complex statistical calculations. For example, if you have in mind climate modeling, it's not easy to communicate this complex value interplay that occurs in this climate modeling. So there is a large number and different types of value choices that are involved, and it's not so easy to express and to be transparent about everything, even if someone is aware of her value choices. So transparency will promote trust in a broad, robust way only if the public and scientists understand how value choices influence the result and understand what alternative value choices could have been made and how they would have influenced the results. So as you see, this is quite far-reaching claim. So transparency should be understood in that way that people should understand alternative value choices and in which way alternative value choices would produce different scientific results. So it's quite strange and quite substantial requirement, let's say. Moreover, in many cases, transparency doesn't amount to much more than a warning. So offering, in many cases, or expressing your value choices may be a reason to distrust rather than trust. If scientists say that, okay, I'm modeling this climate, but I have very, let's say, controversial assumptions about discounting of future life, so it may in some way be a reason to distrust him, I mean to distrust in his research. Second approach, how to deal with this non-epistemic value problem and trust, is just say that we should ground trust in an alignment of values. So the assumption of this view is that the reasons for distrust come from the fact that values of scientists may diverge from the values of the public. So the simple solution is that we just should have the same values, we should share values with scientists whom we trust. So here is a quotation from research from a recent article. Trust requires that the member of the public knows that the scientist has worked from value choices that are in line with her own. It is rational to trust and defer to experts, depend on the degree of interest alignment. In this case, it is word interest, not value, but I think it is very similar approach. So if a scientist discloses her values to me and I see that they align with my own, then assuming that I have reason to trust her purely scientific competences, it seems that I should accept her conclusions, even if I don't understand how her value judgments impacted those conclusions. The main problem with this approach is that in this understanding, science is in some sense an ideological enterprise. It is, basic assumption is that we should share values with scientists we trust, so it is not the issue of, let's say, factual agreement, but the basic is some, let's say, ideological or value-based agreement with scientists we trust. So it may also lead to very negative consequences like further politicization of science, and it may create many sciences or sub-sciences in this sense that many people may accept different scientific results because different value choices they accept or share with people they trust. So let's have an example. Faced with one experimental design that is more prone to false positive and another that is more prone to false negative, either choice may be scientifically legitimate. It may therefore be appropriate for more, let's say, in environment context, more environment-minded citizens to rely on different studies than citizens more concerned about, let's say, economic development. So it is a risk that we will divide science in different subfields. For example, if people with different risk preferences will produce different scientific results because they will favor either avoiding false positive or avoiding false negatives. Let's go to the third solution. Some people, for example, Schroeder in a recent article in British Journal for the Philosophy of Science, argued that we should ground trust in democratic values. And he claims when scientists need to set standards for inductive risk, establish classification schemes for value load and concepts, or choose an economic discount rate, scientists should use democratic values when arriving at their primary or top line results. So as you see, these highlighted words are exactly similar to my examples I started with. So in his argument, these controversies I started with, these three cases, the values we should accept in these three cases should be in some way democratically evaluated, or preferences should be found some democratic method. Obvious question is how can we find this democratically? How can we elicit human values or preferences in a democratic way? He proposes, he just sketches some proposals. So he mentions, for example, deliberative democracy exercise, so just some kind of discussion between scientists and people. He mentions also public referendum or referenda, or just opinion surveys. So the assumption of this view is that in order for an individual to truly trust science, the science must be built on values that have some kind of legitimacy for her. So it doesn't mean that I have to accept this value, but I must feel that these values have some legitimacy in this sense that were properly elected in a proper procedure, let's say. For example, scientists conducted some survey and know what are preferences in their own community, and in this sense, even if I'm not in the majority, I know that my preferences are in some sense or were visible for scientists, because it's like voting for a party that is in opposition. Yes, so I'm not going to argue with my, I can argue with my government that I don't like, but still I feel that I voted for, not for them, but for someone else. So in this sense, my preferences were taken into account in some way. So the main problem with this account, that it's, in my opinion, in some sense superficially democratic. It's not so democratic as Schroeder wants. For example, in one place he claims that the resulting values may need to be filtered or laundered. Filtering may be necessary to remove politically illegitimate values, such as racist values, and laundering to clean up values that are unrefined or based on false empirical beliefs. So there is very strong filter, let's say, to filter or launder those values that are not proper in a democratic society. The second issue is how to determine what is relevant population. I mean, so obviously in the European Union, for example, we are voting for our members of our parliaments within countries and within European Union. But should we vote in the same way to non-epistemic value judgments? I mean, or should we have some like a global government or global survey of values? Obviously, there are many risk preferences may be also culturally loaded, so there may be huge differences. There is no easy answer. What is the relevant population? And this is, I think, quite different in case of political institutions that are historically established in some sense. And it's very different in case of, let's say, scientific voting or voting about values that are relevant in science context. And the third problem is some way of idealization of scientific process in for example, he claims if scientific conclusions are based on objective facts plus democratic values, any two scientists investigating the same problem in the same social and political context should reach roughly the same conclusions. So in some sense, it may be some kind of idealization of scientific process that if we have the same values, we will always have roughly the same conclusions, no matter what other methodological choices we have. Moreover, this problem is also, solution is also very, let's say, individualistic and does not take into account the collective action or group action problem. For example, in one place of his paper, Schroeder writes, gives this example. Suppose a pesticide is declared to pose no health risk on the basis of a study grounded in democratic values. Sally, however, is extremely risk-averse person. Sally ought to recognize that for policy purposes, the pesticide should be considered safe. But Sally's acceptance of this conclusion for policy purposes doesn't seem like it should extend to her personal decisions. If she is deciding whether to use the pesticide in her own garden, it seems reasonable for her not to place much stock in this study. So this is vision of individuals who can be strictly limited from society. I mean, I can accept that something may not be safe, but I don't use it. I just don't have to use any other collective goods that are produced with this method. So I think this is quite, naive ideal and very individualistic, or too individualistic in some sense. So if we think about our three cases I started with, so I don't see how it is possible to have preferences or values of population, how to know these values and how to decide on this ground. For example, in this first case of human embryos, there are obviously very different approaches that are very important for different people, so they constitute their own personality. I mean, what I think about beginning of human life may be kind of deciding about which person I am. So in this sense, it's not easy to elicit these preferences and treat them as a political preferences, as for example, voting preferences for one party and another. So these disagreements are deeper in some sense, much deeper than differences in political context. The same is with, or different issue is with inductive risk and this statistical analysis problems. There are very different perspectives you can have on some regulatory issues. For example, in the United States, there is a right to try. People may want to try some drug even if it's not accepted on the market because they are, for example, dying of cancer and just want to try. So the personal perspective may be very different, and the risk evaluation for their own or for their, for example, children may be very different than risk preferences for the population. So again, it's not easy, and it's not easy to understand how can we democratically find the proper risk preferences, for example, in some population, even if we define this population in one way or another. There may be very different risk preferences, and many of them may be rational, fully rational. For example, it is very rational from some perspective to have this right to try even if some drug is not accepted on the market. And finally, in case of this global burden of disease and case of wrongness of death, obviously there are issues with framing. I mean, the way you frame people's death may result in different answers. So there's well-known, for example, Asian disease problem by Kahneman and Tversky that shows that people have completely different answer if a problem is framed in letting die or in case of killing. So and some argue that both of these preferences or both of these opinions may be in some sense legitimate because people understand killing as an act of doing something and letting die as a kind of allowing. So again, it's difficult to avoid this framing problem in case, for example, of evaluating the wrongness of death. Okay, thank you very much.